Neil Braddock held his phone sideways, the way people hold phones when they want to make sure they capture the full width of something ridiculous. He was laughing before he even pressed record. Behind him, the November sky over Millhaven, Vermont had gone the color of old pewter, the kind of gray that means business, the kind that arrives in early winter and stays until it has made its point. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees since morning. His breath came out in visible puffs that the camera would pick up, adding to the general atmosphere of a man documenting something he couldn't quite believe was actually happening. What he was filming was a structure, using the word structure generously, 10 feet by 10 feet maybe, buried under so much wild ivy honeysuckle and unchecked decades of vegetation that from any distance greater than 20 feet, it looked less like a building and more like a particularly aggressive shrub. The wood that was visible beneath the greenery had weathered to the pale silver gray of driftwood, cracked and splitting along grain lines that had given up trying to hold together. One small window on the visible side was broken, its jagged edge furred with old cobwebs. The roof, what could be seen of it, sagged in the middle with the defeated posture of something that had been carrying too much weight for too long. Standing in front of this structure were two people. A woman, 68 years old, with white hair pulled back under a wool hat that had seen better seasons. She wore a practical canvas jacket, work pants, and boots that were adequate but not warm enough for what the weather was becoming. Her name was Vera Hutchins, and she was not looking at the phone. She was looking at the structure in front of her with an expression that Neil Braddock, watching through his screen, could not quite read. It was not the expression of someone who had made a terrible mistake. It was something more complicated than that, something that looked almost like recognition. Beside her stood a man 70 years old, a full head taller than his wife, with the broad shoulders and slightly stooped posture of someone who had spent decades doing physical work that paid adequately but not generously. His name was Clem Hutchins. He had a hand resting on his wife's shoulder. He was watching the same structure she was watching, and his expression was easier to read than hers. It was the expression of a man who trusts his wife so completely that he will follow her into situations he cannot entirely explain, because 45 years of marriage has taught him that her instincts are worth more than his calculations. "This is the most ridiculous thing Millhaven has ever seen," Neil Braddock said to his phone, not bothering to lower his voice. The Hutchins were 30 feet away. They could hear him clearly. His wife Suzanne was already typing on her own phone, composing the caption that would accompany the video when she posted it. Neil had already mentally drafted the comment he would leave on the post. Something about senior housing assistance. Something about what not to do with your last $3. He was composing it as he filmed, running the phrase through different variations, trying to find the wording that was funniest without being quite cruel enough to get him in trouble. Vera Hutchins did not turn around. She reached back and found her husband's hand, and she squeezed it once, and then she kept looking at the structure in front of her with that expression that Neil Braddock couldn't name, and the phone kept rolling, and the gray Vermont sky pressed down on all of them with complete indifference to any of it. 6 weeks earlier, Clem Hutchins had been given a clean bill of health for the 8th consecutive month. The oncologist at the Burlington Medical Center had shaken his hand and called it remarkable, which was the word she used for outcomes she hadn't fully predicted. Pancreatic cancer stage 3, diagnosed 2 years prior, a 20% survival rate when you were generous about it. Clem had gone through surgery that lasted 9 hours, chemotherapy that made him so sick he had lost 40 pounds in 3 months, and radiation that burned his skin and stole whatever remaining physical strength the chemo had left behind. He had been, for most of those 2 years, a man in the process of being destroyed by something invisible and relentless that lived inside him. And then, against the odds that his oncologist had laid out with the careful precision of someone who preferred to manage expectations rather than raise hopes, the cancer was gone. Clem Hutchins had beaten it. Vera had stood in that examination room and cried in a way she had not cried since her father's funeral, the deep, ragged crying of someone who has been holding their breath for 2 years and has finally been told they are allowed to exhale. Clem had put his arms around her and held her against his chest while the oncologist quietly gathered her materials and gave them the room. He was alive. He was here. Everything else, as Vera would say many times over the months that followed, was just details. The problem was that the details were very large. Clem had worked maintenance at Millhaven High School for 30 years. He had fixed boilers and replaced lockers and kept the parking lot clear of ice on February mornings so that parents could drop their children off safely. He had been thanked by graduating seniors every June for as long as anyone could remember, thanked by name, because he was the kind of man who knew the names of every student in the building and who understood that a school is not its curriculum, but its daily texture. The warmth of a hallway in January, the functioning of a locker on the first day back after break. He had been good at his job. He had been reliable and skilled and quietly essential. When his diagnosis came, the school district had expressed sympathy with considerable warmth and offered him a medical leave of absence. When his leave extended beyond what their policy accommodated, they had expressed further sympathy and explained that due to budget constraints and the need to fill the position permanently, they were restructuring the role. Not firing him, restructuring. The distinction was meaningful to their attorneys and meaningless to Vera, who was sitting at the kitchen table reading the letter while Clem was in the hospital for his second round of chemotherapy, and who understood the word restructuring to mean exactly what it meant. 30 years. Gone in a letter that used the word restructuring 4 times and the word sorry not once. The insurance had covered portions of Clem's treatment. The portions it did not cover were substantial, arriving in envelopes that Vera opened at the kitchen table after Clem was asleep because she did not want him to see them while he was fighting for his life. $5,000 for a specialized scan. $12,000 for a medication the insurance company deemed experimental, despite the oncologist's documentation of its necessity. $8,000 for a procedure their plan categorized as not medically necessary, a categorization that made their oncologist so angry she had personally called the insurance company's medical director and spent 45 minutes arguing in language that Vera, listening from the hallway, had never heard a physician use before. The insurance company had not changed its determination. They drained their savings first. $38,000 accumulated over 3 decades of careful, unheroic financial management gone in 6 months. Then the second mortgage on the house they had paid off over 25 years, the house on Maple Street where they had brought Vera's mother for Thanksgiving every year for 2 decades, where their 2 children had grown up and moved away to their own lives in other states. The equity from the second mortgage lasted 8 months. Then they sold the house. They moved into an apartment believing they could rebuild. But rebuilding requires income, and Clem had none, and Vera's hours at the Millhaven Public Library had been cut to almost nothing as the town's budget contracted. The apartment rent was manageable in the abstract and impossible in practice. They fell behind, then further behind. Then last month, the apartment was gone. For 3 weeks, they had been sleeping in their car. A 1998 Honda Accord with 230,000 miles on the odometer, parked in a rotating series of locations that seemed least likely to generate complaints. The car smelled of the cheap fast food they had been eating. The back seat held 2 boxes of personal items, the things Vera had chosen when she finally accepted that they could not keep everything. Photographs from before the illness, letters her mother had written over the years, a few books that had belonged to her grandmother, 3 suitcases, 2 boxes, 45 years of a shared life. And in Vera's wallet, 3 $1 bills and 17 cents in change. The county assistance office was a beige building on a street of beige buildings, indistinguishable from the others except for the sign and the line of people outside it that formed before the doors opened every morning. Vera and Clem sat in plastic chairs and waited their turn with the dignity of people who have decided that dignity is the one thing that cannot be taken from them, that they will maintain it regardless of the circumstances, that it is not a luxury but a necessity, the structural element that holds a person together when everything external has given way. The clerk who called their name was a woman in her 40s with the tired eyes of someone who absorbed other people's worst days for 40 hours a week and carried them home in the evenings. She looked up when they approached her window. Names, she said, Vera and Clem Hutchins. Vera said, reason for assistance. Vera looked at Clem. He nodded the slight nod of a man who has made peace with having his story told to strangers. My husband had cancer, Vera said. Pancreatic, diagnosed 2 years ago. The treatment saved his life, but it cost us everything. The clerk's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something more human. Is he in remission? 8 months, Clem said. His voice was gravelly but steady. The clerk looked at them over the paperwork. Then she looked at the space behind them, where in an office like this, a lawyer or an advocate or a family member sometimes sat. There was no one there. "I'm processing an application for emergency food assistance," she said, "and I can put you on the waiting list for subsidized housing. But I have to be honest with you, that list is usually 6 to 8 months." "We don't have 6 to 8 months," Clem said quietly. "We don't have 6 to 8 days. Vermont winter." A car. He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. The clerk was quiet for a moment. "There's a shelter on we tried," Vera said. "They're full. They said to come back in a week." The clerk printed forms, emergency food assistance up to 3 days of groceries from the community center on 5th Street, a list of churches, organizations, resources. Vera took the papers with a quiet thank you, and they walked back out into the November air. And Clem put his arm around her shoulders, and they moved slowly toward the Honda without speaking. "Well, figure it out," Clem said. The words came out more automatically than convincingly. "I know," Vera said, but she pulled her wallet out and looked at the $3 bills inside, and the impossible arithmetic of poverty laid itself out before her, the way it always does with the specific cruelty of a problem that has no solution, only a sequence of smaller problems, each of which resolves temporarily into the next. Gas or food? Today's answer chosen from two bad options, making tomorrow's question slightly worse. Vera put the wallet back. "Let's drive," she said. "Maybe we'll see something." They drove through Millhaven the way you drive through a town you have lived in for 40 years and are suddenly seeing from outside it. Every corner holding a piece of the life they had built and then lost. The library where Vera had worked its windows, lit in the November gray, the reading room visible from the street. She had shelved books there for 22 years. She knew the call numbers of the sections she cared about the way a musician knows the positions of notes on a keyboard by feel and reflex rather than thought. The high school where Clem had worked, the parking lot he had salted and shoveled through 40 Vermont winters, the building whose every mechanical system he had understood and maintained. A woman was walking across that parking lot now, her arms full of folders, moving quickly in the cold. She did not look up as they drove past the house on Maple Street. Vera did not ask Clem to slow down, but he did anyway without being asked, because 45 years together means you know when to slow down without being told. They looked at it together through the car windows. Someone had repainted the shutters. The garden that Vera had kept for 20 years, the roses and the perennial beds that bloomed in a sequence she had planned one winter afternoon with a notebook and seed catalogs, was cleared. Clean beds, bare soil, a blank slate for whoever came next. "There," Vera said. Clem had not seen the sign yet. He looked in the direction she was pointing. A handwritten notice taped to a telephone pole. He pulled the Honda to the curb. "Estate sale. Everything must go, including property structures. Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., cash only, an address at the bottom." "It's today," Vera said. "Just after 2, Addie," Clem said. "We have $3. She was looking at the sign. "Let's just look," she said, "please." Something in the way she said it made him nod. The estate sale was at the far edge of town, a farmhouse that had belonged to a man named Jenkins, dead 6 months with no heirs. The yard held the scattered inventory of a life, furniture and dishes and tools, and the accumulated objects of decades being assessed by strangers with clipboards and measuring tapes. Vera and Clem moved through it slowly. They did not touch anything. Everything was priced beyond what they had, and they both knew it, and there was something specific and particular about moving through a sale of things you cannot buy, a kind of museum visit where the objects behind the glass have price tags. They were nearly at the edge of the yard, nearly ready to go back to the car when Vera stopped. A smaller sign, handwritten, stuck to a tree at the far edge of the property. "Unwanted structure, small outbuilding on back corner, not maintained, sold as is, $5 or best offer," Silas, Vera said. She meant Clem. She had called him by his middle name twice in 45 years, both times when something significant was happening. He heard it immediately. They walked together toward the back of the property, past the main farmhouse, past a weathered barn, past a tool shed to the very corner, where the property line met a dense wall of old-growth trees. And there, almost entirely consumed by wild ivy and honeysuckle, and the patient work of decades of unchecked growth, was the structure. It was small, impossibly small, 10 feet by 10 feet, perhaps slightly less. The walls were old wood, weathered silver gray. The roof, under all the vegetation, suggested it had somehow maintained its basic geometry. One small window on each wall, four total, all obscured by grime or vegetation. The door was barely distinguishable from the surrounding vines hung slightly crooked on its frame. A man approached them, late 50s, work clothes. The estate sale manager, the practical person responsible for moving everything on this property before the sun went down. You folks interested in that, he asked, sounding genuinely surprised. What is it, Vera asked. Hell if I know, the man said. Been there since before Jenkins bought this place, and that was 40 years ago. He never used it. Just let it go. Sign says 5, but honestly, if you've got 3, it's yours. I just need it gone. Clem looked at his wife. Addie, we can't live in that. It's shelter, Vera said quietly. She turned to the manager. We'll take it. The man looked at her the way people look at someone who has said something they cannot quite parse. Lady, I'm not sure you understand. That thing is not a house. That's not even a shed. It's maybe 100 square feet, probably full of rats. The roof has holes. There's no electricity, no water, no anything. That's basically firewood. $3, Vera said. Clem was quiet. He looked at his wife's face. He had learned over 45 years the difference between the time she was guessing and the time she knew something. This was the latter. Your funeral, the manager said. Let me get the paperwork. A small crowd had gathered, estate sale shoppers who had noticed the exchange and drifted over the way people at such events are always tracking anything unusual, any deviation from the expected script. Did they actually buy that thing? A woman near the back said to her husband, not quietly enough. For $3, that's still too much, he replied, and several people laughed. Neil and Suzanne Braddock appeared from somewhere near the farmhouse, phones already raised. They were relatively new to Millhaven, having bought one of the large Victorian houses on Main Street 2 years ago, with the kind of money that announces itself in the way people carry it. Neil had the particular confidence of a man who has never had to calculate whether he could afford both gas and food on the same day. Excuse me, Suzanne said, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who has learned that mockery lands better when it enters through a door labeled concern. Did you actually purchase that structure? Yes, Vera said. But where would you even, how would 2 people possibly will manage, Vera said. Thank you for your concern. Suzanne Braddock looked at her for a moment, then looked at Clem, then pulled her phone up and began composing something. Neil was filming already. Live in it, he said, looking through his screen. That's not a house, that's a matchbox. Mind your business, Clem said, his voice steady and low. The estate sale manager returned with a handwritten bill of sale and a key. Old and rusty, slightly bent, the kind of key that seems to have been made for a lock that no longer quite matches it. He took their $3 bills, gave them the bill of sale, and the key shook his head slowly. It's all yours, he said. God help you. As Vera and Clem walked back toward their car, the sound followed them. Whispers and laughter, and the particular commentary of people who are watching a spectacle they did not expect to find at a Saturday estate sale in November. Did they really spend their last money on that? I heard they've been living in their car. Maybe they think anything's better than nothing. Poor souls. Probably crazy. Vera walked with her head up and her hand in Clem's hand. She did not turn around. She did not acknowledge any of it. She kept walking until they reached the Honda and got in and closed the doors. In the silence of the car, Clem exhaled slowly. Addie, he said, we just spent our last $3 on a shack that might not even be structurally sound. We have no money for gas, no money for food, no idea if that thing is even habitable. I know. So why did we do it? She turned to look at him. In the 45 years of their marriage, through the raising of children, and the paying of mortgages, and the slow accumulation of an ordinary life, and then the violent loss of it, Clem. Hutchins had watched his wife's face go through every kind of weather a human face can go through. He knew what fear looked like on her. He knew what grief looked like. He knew what exhaustion looked like. What he saw now was something he had not seen on her face in a very long time. She pressed her hand to her chest. Because when I looked at that structure, she said, I didn't see junk. I saw something else. I don't know what yet, but I felt it. Right here, I felt like this was meant to be ours. He studied her for a long moment. Okay, he said, then let's go see our home. According to the bill of sale, the structure sat on a small parcel of land at the edge of the Jenkins property. Approximately 500 square feet of land deeded with the structure itself. We own land, Clem said, looking at the paperwork. He had read it twice. For the first time in 2 years, we own property. We own a home, Vera said. They waited until the estate sale closed and the last cars had left. Then they drove the Honda carefully around the back of the property, navigating over rough ground until they reached the corner where the structure stood in the fading late afternoon light. Up close, without the distraction of the crowd and the noise, it looked worse and also different at the same time. The vegetation covering it was extraordinary in its thoroughness, decades of growth that had genuinely merged with the structure rather than simply leaning against it. The wood visible through the gaps was silvery and ancient. The door was somewhere behind and beneath a curtain of dense vine that had been growing across it for at least 2 decades. But the walls were standing, plumb and solid as far as Clem could tell, running his hand along the exterior. Old lumber, the kind of tight-grained, slow-grown wood that the 19th century had access to, and the 21st century mostly does not. He tapped it with his knuckle and heard the dense sound of something still structurally present. It's small, Clem said. It's ours, Vera said. Clem began pulling vines away from the door, methodical and steady, working through the layers of growth, the way a person works through a difficult problem, one element at a time. Vera moved to a window and began clearing vegetation from the glass, trying to see what the interior held. After 20 minutes, the door was accessible. Clem tried the key. The mechanism resisted stiff from years of disuse. He jiggled it carefully with the patient competence of a man who had spent 30 years maintaining old and difficult mechanical systems. The lock turned. The door itself wouldn't move. Swollen from moisture, entangled still with roots and vines that had worked their way under and around the frame. Clem put his shoulder to it and pushed. With a sound that was part groan of old wood and part protest of hinges that hadn't moved in a generation, the door swung inward. The smell was the first thing, mold and mildew and the particular damp darkness of a sealed space. The second thing was the interior itself, visible now in the beam of Clem's phone flashlight. Dirt and dead leaves on the floor. Cobwebs emanating every corner and surface. The evidence of small animals, mice, certainly possibly more. A ceiling higher than expected, maybe 8 feet, giving the tiny space a vertical dimension that surprised them both. The floor was wooden planks. Clem stepped carefully inside his weight, testing each board. They creaked, but held. The walls were solid wood construction, the same dense old-growth timber as the exterior, fitted together with a craftsmanship that was visible even under the grime. The structure was sound. It was filthy and dark and smelled of decades of sealed decay, and it was 100 square feet, and it was theirs, and it was standing. Then Vera, her flashlight moving slowly across the wall, stopped. On the far wall, barely visible beneath years of grime and cobwebs, something had been carved deep into the wood. Not scratched or drawn, carved with a tool deliberately by someone who meant it to last. Clem, she said. She pointed. He brought his light over. The carving was in 2 lines, the first 3 characters, and a year the second a phrase. E.g., the first line read, 1847. Below it, harder to make out, but still legible to someone looking carefully, foundation stone. First structure, Millhaven. They stood in the dim interior of the smallest building either of them had ever occupied, and they looked at those carved words, and the space around them changed quality. Not the space itself. The space was still dark and cold and smelled of mouse and mold. But the quality of it changed the way a room changes quality when you understand what happened there, when the history of a place becomes suddenly and specifically real rather than abstract. Someone's initials, Clem said. And a date, Vera said. 1847. She said the number again quietly as if she was trying to feel the weight of it. That's 176 years ago. They looked at each other across the dim interior of the 100-square-foot structure they had purchased for their last $3, surrounded by the debris of generations, with the carved testimony of someone long dead on the wall behind them, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. The structure everyone had laughed at. The matchbox. The pile of junk. It was nearly 2 centuries old, and suddenly Vera's certainty, the thing she had felt in her chest when she first looked at it, through the tangle of vines and neglect, the feeling that this place was meant to be theirs, felt less like desperation and more like something else. Something she did not have a word for yet. something that would come to her and to everyone else in Millhaven in the days that followed. They spent that night in the Honda parked discreetly behind a gas station, as they had been doing for 3 weeks. Both of them slept poorly, as they had been sleeping poorly for 3 weeks, cold and uncomfortable, in the way that people who were not designed to sleep in cars in Vermont in November are cold and uncomfortable. But something had shifted. In the morning, when Clem woke at 4:30, as he always did, trained by decades of early maintenance shifts, he found Vera already awake beside him, her phone dim in her hand, writing something in the notes application. "Can't sleep?" he asked, thinking she said. He reached over and took her hand in the dark. "What are you thinking?" She was quiet for a moment. "E.G.," she said finally. "Elias, or Edward, or Edmund. Someone with those initials built something in 1847 and called it the first structure of Millhaven. And then the town grew up around it and forgot where it came from." She turned to look at him in the thin light from her phone screen. "Tomorrow I want to go to the town hall, look at records, find out who E.G. was." Clem nodded. "Even if this building is historically interesting, it doesn't necessarily help us practically. We still have no money, no food, no income." "I know," Vera said, "but knowledge is something. Right now it's all we have to work with." He squeezed her hand. "Then we work with it." In the morning they gathered what they had: a broom found in a dumpster behind a hardware store, a box of garbage bags, a bottle of water refilled from a public fountain, the bill of sale, the old key. They drove back to the structure in the early light. The November morning was cold and clear, the kind of clear that follows a cold front, where everything has an edge to it, a sharpness, a precision. The structure sat in its corner of the old Jenkins property, exactly as it had sat the evening before, under its mantle of vegetation, ancient and unremarkable and entirely overlooked. They were just beginning to work, Vera sweeping inside while Clem pulled more vines from the exterior, when a car slowed on the road at the edge of the property. Neil Braddock's SUV. It pulled over. Both doors opened. Neil and Suzanne Braddock got out with their phones. "Oh my God," Suzanne said loudly. They actually came back to it. Neil was already live. "Day 2 of the Hutchins Matchbox experiment," he said into his phone. "Subscribe for updates." Vera inside the structure heard every word. She stopped sweeping. From outside Roy Alderman's truck appeared a man Clem had worked alongside at the high school for a decade before Roy left for a better-paying job at a contractor in Burlington. Roy pulled his window down. "Clem, buddy, come on, be reasonable. You two should go to the shelter, apply for senior housing. Anything but this. You know this is crazy." Clem kept pulling vines. "We'll make it work. Come on, man, I'm trying to help. Then leave us alone." Roy shook his head, took a photo, and drove away. Vera set down her broom and came outside. She could see her husband's shoulders. She had been reading those shoulders for 45 years. She knew what tightness looked like on them, and she knew what shame looked like, and she knew what it cost a man who had worked with dignity for 30 years to stand in a field while people photographed him for entertainment. She walked over and stopped in front of him. He looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with joy. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was low. "I'm sorry I couldn't give you better than this." She took his face in both her hands. "You beat cancer," she said. "You're alive. You're here with me. Everything else is just details." He laughed. It came out with a bitter edge. "Details. Addie, we're living in a shack that people are filming to post online for laughs. For now," she said. "But I still feel it, Clem. I still feel like this place is something. Like we're supposed to be here. Trust me, please." He looked into her eyes for a long moment. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 45 years. The way a man looks at someone whose judgment he has staked his life on many times and has never found wanting. "Okay," he said, "but I need you to be right about this, because I can't take much more of it." "I'm right," Vera said. She said it with a certainty she had not fully earned yet, but she said it with the complete confidence of someone who has learned that certainty stated clearly and without qualification sometimes becomes the thing that makes it true. They went back to work. The onlookers eventually grew bored and left. By late afternoon, the exterior was mostly cleared of vegetation, and the full structure was visible for perhaps the first time in decades. Small, ancient, weathered to the bone, but solid. Inside, Vera had cleared enough of the floor to reveal the wooden planks beneath, worn and grime-covered, but intact. She had wiped the walls in sections, revealing the same close-grained, old lumber throughout, the kind of wood that does not exist in modern construction because the forests that produced it have not existed for over a century. And on the wall, with the carved initials, with the debris cleared away and the surface wiped clean, the words were clearer now. Carved deep, intended to last, e.g. 1847, foundation stone, first structure, Millhaven. Vera stood in front of those words as the light through the small windows turned golden and then amber with the approach of evening. She pressed her fingertips gently against the carved letters, feeling the depth of them, the intention in them, the century and 3/4 of silence they had been wading through. Who are you, she thought, and what did you leave here? That night, they slept in the structure for the first time. They brought in the sleeping bags and the lantern and the small cooler with what food they had, the last of it, a few items that would not last another day. They laid the sleeping bags side by side on the swept wooden floor, and the space was so small that the bags touched, and they lay in the dark listening to the structure settle around them. It was cold. The walls were not insulated. The broken window on the north side let in a draft that no amount of improvisation with the materials they had could fully address. But it was a roof. It was four walls. It was shelter in the specific and non-metaphorical sense of the word, a structure between them and the Vermont November, and after 3 weeks in the Honda, that distinction was not small. Vera lay on her back and looked at the ceiling in the dim light of the lantern and thought about the carved words on the wall behind her. Foundation stone, first structure, Millhaven. She thought about the town they had lived in for 40 years, the town that had watched their fall from respectability to destitution with a mixture of pity and entertainment. The town built on streets that had names and histories and a timeline that reached back to a beginning she had never thought about. Every town has a beginning. Every town has a first structure. And this one covered in vines and sold for $3 at an estate sale as an inconvenience to be disposed of. This one had been built by someone who signed their work with 2 letters in a year, who called it a foundation stone, who apparently believed that what they were building would outlast their own life and become the beginning of something larger. Vera turned her head and looked at the carved wall in the lantern light. Clem, she said softly. He was still awake. She knew by his breathing. I'm going to find out who E.G. was, she said. Tomorrow. Whatever it takes. He reached over in the small space between their sleeping bags and found her hand. Okay, he said. Because whoever they were, she continued, they called this the foundation stone, the first structure. They put it in writing and carved it into the wall and meant it to be found. Found by who? By someone who needed to know it. The lantern burned low. The structure made the small sounds that very old buildings make in cold weather, the tiny adjustments of wood that has been contracting and expanding through 176 winters and knows the rhythm of it by now. Vera lay in the dark and held her husband's hand and listened to those sounds. And beneath all of it, beneath the cold and the dark and the uncertainty and the exhaustion of 3 weeks sleeping in a car, beneath the memory of the day's mockery and the weight of everything that had been lost, she felt it again. The thing she had felt when she first looked at the structure from across the yard of an estate sale on a November afternoon with $3 in her pocket and nowhere to go. Not desperation, not delusion. Something older than either of those things. Something she had no precise name for, but which felt in the dark of the oldest building in Millhaven very much like the beginning of something. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Vermont night pressed down cold and enormous and full of stars that did not care about any of it. The structure held. Part 2, Beneath the Rotting Wood History. The second morning arrived the way November mornings arrive in Vermont, without apology, without warmth, with the specific gray indifference of a sky that has decided it has nothing to prove to anyone. Vera woke first. She had slept lightly the way she had been sleeping for months. One ear, always tracking sounds, cataloging them, measuring their threat level before her conscious mind had fully engaged with the process. The sound of the Honda's engine ticking as it cooled. The sound of Clem's breathing, which she still monitored even now, 8 months after his last clean scan, because old habits of vigilance do not surrender easily when they have been earned through genuine terror. The sound of wind moving through old wood, which was a new sound, a sound she was still learning to hear as something other than cause for alarm. She lay in her sleeping bag on the wooden floor of the tiny structure and looked at the ceiling in the dark before dawn and thought about the carved letters on the wall, e.g. 1847. She had looked at them for a long time the night before after Clem had finally fallen asleep lying on her side with the phone's dim light illuminating the carved initials until the battery warning made her put it away. She had traced them with her fingertip in the dark. Deep cuts made with intention, made by someone who wanted them to last. Someone who had stood in this same space and pressed a blade into the wood and decided that their presence here, at this particular moment, in this particular place, was worth recording. Someone who had, for reasons she could not yet understand, not just signed the wall, but written something else beneath the signature. Something she had only glimpsed in the failing light, something she needed to see clearly in proper daylight. She got up carefully, not wanting to wake Clem, and pulled her coat over her clothes and stepped outside. The dawn was coming up cold and pale over the hills to the east. The property was quiet. The estate sale was long concluded, the farmhouse empty, now beginning its transition into whatever it would become next. At the far back corner, their tiny structure stood in the early light, its ivy and honeysuckle stripped back enough now to reveal its bones, the weathered gray wood visible in long sections, the roof still sagging in the middle, but clearly more substantial than it had appeared from a distance. She stood and looked at it. 100 square feet, a rectangle of old wood that had been standing in this corner for longer than anyone in Millhaven could apparently remember. Longer than the town itself, if her instinct was correct. The feeling she had experienced the day before, the feeling she had spent 45 years learning to trust rather than dismiss, had settled into something more specific overnight. Not just that this place was meant to be theirs, something more directional than that. Something that felt less like emotion and more like information. She went back inside. In the growing light through the dirty windows, she moved to the wall with the carved letters and crouched down to look more carefully at what was beneath them. She had seen it in the dim flashlight beam the night before, had thought she understood what she was seeing, but had not been certain. Now, in the better light of early morning, she was certain. Beneath the initials carved with the same tool but pressed more lightly, as if the person had been working faster or with less certainty, were words. Foundation stone. First structure. Millhaven. She read them 3 times. Then she stood up and turned around and looked at Clem, who was just beginning to stir in his sleeping bag. Clem. He opened his eyes. He had the particular quality of waking that came from months of interrupted sleep during treatment alert immediately, as if his body had decided that waking slowly was a luxury it could no longer afford. Come look at this. He got up and came to her, and she pointed, and he crouched down and read the words. And when he straightened, she could see in his face the same rearrangement she had felt in her own understanding, the specific sensation of the scale of a thing shifting. Foundation stone, he said slowly. First structure. She nodded. That's not a signature, Clem said. That's a declaration. Someone built this and wrote that, so whoever found it later would know what they were standing in. She looked around the small space, the floor under their feet, the walls around them, the ceiling above them that was higher than you expected, higher than it had any reason to be for a structure this small. We need to find out who E.G. was, she said. We need to find out what this building actually is, Clem replied. They looked at each other in the morning light. And then the sound they had been braced for since they arrived came across the property from the direction of the road. The specific sound of an expensive engine slowing of tires on gravel, of someone who had decided that whatever was happening in this back corner was worth stopping for again. Neil Braddock had a gift for making documentation feel like cruelty. He appeared at the edge of the cleared area with his phone already up, already recording, wearing a jacket that cost more than Vera and Clem had spent on clothing collectively in the past 3 years. Suzanne was behind him, also recording with the particular bright energy of someone who has found a reliable source of content and intends to extract from it as efficiently as possible. Day 2, Neil announced, his voice pitched for the phone rather than for conversation. The Hutchins Matchbox experiment continues. Can you see them back there? They're actually still here. Vera did not go outside. She stayed at the window and watched through the grime and was aware of Clem beside her, aware of the way his jaw had set. He's got 300 followers now on that post, Suzanne called to Neil, checking her phone. 400. People are sharing it. For what Clem said quietly, his voice meant only for Vera. She did not answer. There was no answer worth giving. Neil had moved closer still, recording narrating in the voice of someone covering a nature documentary. And here we see two senior citizens attempting to inhabit what appears to be approximately 100 square feet of century-old wood. Current weather 28 degrees Fahrenheit. One must admire the commitment, if not the judgment. He laughed. It was the laugh of someone who had never been cold and hungry simultaneously, and could not therefore imagine why those conditions might produce decisions that looked irrational to the comfortable. Clem moved toward the door. Vera touched his arm. Let him. He stopped. The effort it cost him was visible in his face. Roy Alderman appeared at the edge of the property about 40 minutes later, which told Vera that Neil had tagged their location in the posts and that Roy had been watching his phone. Roy was a broad man in his 50s who had worked alongside Clem at Millhaven High for nearly 15 years before transferring to the Public Works Department. He had been at Clem's retirement gathering and had shaken him his hand and said the things people say at retirement gatherings and had not been in contact since. He stood at the edge of the cleared area with his hands in his jacket pockets and called out, "Buddy, seriously, you've got to stop this." Clem came to the doorway. "Roy, come on, man. There's a shelter on Birch Street," Roy said. "Full right now, I heard, but they might have openings by the weekend. You could apply for emergency senior housing. Get in a motel for a few nights if you need to. There are programs for that." "Anything but this." "We're fine here," Clem said. "You're clearly not fine," Roy replied, and his voice had what Vera recognized as the tone of a man who believed he was being helpful, rather than the tone of a man who was performing concern for an audience. "You're living in a structure that's probably not up to any code that matters in November in Vermont at 70 years old. This is not fine." "Thank you, Roy. We'll let you know if we need anything." Roy shook his head with the specific expression of a man washing his hands of a situation he had done his duty toward. He pulled out his phone before he turned to leave. "Got a picture of this for the neighborhood group," he said. "People are asking." Vera watched him walk away and pulled the door closed. The morning that followed was work. Real physical, methodical work, which was in its way a relief after 24 hours of being looked at. They had no new supplies, nothing they hadn't arrived with, but the work of the building itself was available, and they applied themselves to it with the focused attention of people for whom useful activity is the most effective available medication. Clem worked on the exterior, continuing the clearing of vegetation, revealing more of the walls. Vera worked inside, sweeping the remaining debris from the corners, wiping down the walls with the damp cloth she had in her kit. The structure, as it became cleaner, became more legible. The craftsmanship that had been invisible under decades of grime began to show itself. The way the boards fitted together at the corners, the joints tight and precise, in a way that hand-cut lumber in a machine age rarely achieves. The ceiling joinery, visible now that Vera had cleared the cobwebs, showed the same careful attention. This was not a shed, Vera thought, working her cloth along the wall above the carved letters. This was built to last. She was examining the wall near the floor when she felt it, the slight irregularity in the surface beneath her hand, the place where one plank met another at an angle that was not quite what the eye expected, where the grain didn't run the way the surrounding wood ran. She pressed her hand flat and felt the resistance, the very slight spring of wood that had been moved and replaced over many years. "Clem," she called, "come in here." He came in from outside, brushing wood chips from his arms, and she showed him what she had found, and he crouched beside hers, and they both felt it, and then he found the screwdriver in his small kit, and they worked the blade carefully under the edge of the plank, and the plank came up. Not with the resistance of a plank that had never moved, with the smooth ease of a plank that had been designed to move. The cavity beneath was approximately 6 inches deep, running most of the width of the structure. It was clean in the way that sealed spaces stay clean, untouched by the moisture and grime that had invaded every other part of the building. And in the cavity, sitting exactly where it had been placed, was a metal box. "Iron," Clem said, reaching in and lifting it out with both hands. "It's heavy." They carried it outside into better light. It was the size of a large briefcase made from iron plate that had rusted on the outside but not corroded through. The lock, a simple lever mechanism, had fused with rust. Clem worked at it carefully with the screwdriver, applying pressure in increments, listening to the metal, feeling for the point where force would help rather than damage. It took 11 minutes. Vera counted. Then the lock gave with a sound like something very old exhaling, and the lid opened, and they both leaned forward and looked at what had been sealed inside for 176 years. The first thing that registered was the smell. Old paper dry leather, the particular dusty sweetness of organic materials preserved without moisture. Then the objects themselves resolved in the light nested in the box with the careful arrangement of someone who had thought about how long this would need to last and had organized accordingly. A leather-bound journal, its cover cracked but whole, the pages dense with close handwriting. Beneath it, several large sheets of heavy paper folded along old creases, their edges brown with age. Then in the lower section, wrapped separately in a piece of oilcloth that had kept it sealed against any moisture that might have entered a stack of documents. Official documents from the weight and substance of them bearing marks and seals that Vera could not immediately identify. She reached in and lifted the journal with both hands, the way you lift something you understand to be fragile, and opened it to the first page. Journal of Elias Grover. Trading Post Millhaven Settlement, Vermont Territory. Year of our Lord, 1847. The silence between her and Clem had a specific quality she recognized. The quality of people who have understood simultaneously that the size of something has just changed. E.g., Clem said. Elias Grover. Vera replied. She turned pages carefully. The handwriting was the careful cursive of a man who had been formally educated, but was writing under practical conditions in a small structure, in a new settlement, in the years before Vermont's rail connections would bring the outside world properly into range. She read phrases aloud as she turned pages. March 4th, 1847. Post established at River Crossing. Ground frozen still, but structure complete. First travelers through on the second day, 3 trappers from the north who paid in pelts and took provisions. May 14th, 1847. Settlement growing around the post as I hoped. 4 families have staked claims within sight of the trading post. A town begins. November 1847. Hard winter coming. The post is sound and I am glad for the quality of the building. What is built right will last. Vera looked up from the journal and looked at the structure around them. What is built right will last. 176 years, they were standing in proof. They needed help to understand what they were holding. This was not a difficult conclusion to reach. Vera had worked in a library for 20 years. She knew the difference between recognizing that something was significant and understanding precisely what it was, and she knew that the gap between those two things required expertise to cross. The town hall was 3 miles from the property. They had no gate. They walked. November in Vermont is not theatrical about its cruelty. It does not perform. It simply delivers cold with the consistent efficiency of something that has been doing this work for a very long time and sees no reason to change its methods. The temperature was in the low 30s. The sky was the color it had been all morning, that particular New England November color that is neither gray nor white, but something between them. Something that makes the light flat and the shadows absent. Vera walked with her coat pulled close and her hands in her pockets and her chin slightly lowered against the wind. Clem walked beside her and they had been walking together in various forms of weather for 45 years, and they had the comfortable, efficient stride of people who have synchronized their pace so thoroughly that they do not think about it anymore. They passed the library where Vera had worked for 2 decades, which was now closed for budget reasons on Wednesdays. They passed the high school where Clem had spent 30 years, where his replacement had been hired at a lower salary as part of the same restructuring that had eliminated his position while he was in a hospital bed recovering from surgery. They passed Roy Alderman's truck parked outside a diner and did not stop. The building that housed both Town Hall and the public library's main branch was brick 1920s construction, the kind of building that small New England towns built when they wanted to say something permanent about themselves. They pushed through the heavy door into warmth. The librarian at the front desk was a woman in her mid-30s with the specific alert attentiveness of someone who actually likes their work. Her name tag said Lena Hartwell. She looked up as they came in, and whatever she saw in their faces, 2 older people who had clearly walked some distance in the cold, made her pay attention rather than offer the automatic, "How can I help you?" "We need help with historical records," Vera said, "specifically from 1847. We're trying to identify someone with the initials E.G. who may have built one of the first structures in Millhaven." Lena Hartwell set down what she had been doing. 1847, she said. "That's early. Most of our archived materials begin with formal incorporation in the 1870s. But we have some materials in the historical collection." She led them to a back room, climate-controlled the air, slightly different in quality than the main library, more careful, more preserved. She pulled boxes from shelving and set them on a table. I'm also an adjunct in Vermont history at the community college, she said as she worked. So this period is actually my area. Tell me what you found. They told her. She listened without interrupting, which was the quality that Vera noticed first and valued most, the quality of someone for whom listening is not a pause in talking, but a genuine act of attention. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Show me." She pulled on cotton gloves from a drawer and held out her hands, and Vera carefully set the journal in them. Lena Hartwell opened it and read the first page, and her expression changed in a way that Vera had seen before in the faces of people who were historians by genuine inclination encountering primary evidence of something they had only theorized. She turned pages with the focused attention of someone reading in a different way than ordinary reading, extracting information at a different level, cross-referencing against what she already knew. She set the journal down and began moving through the boxes on the table, pulling out documents, checking dates, comparing. She moved quickly now, with the efficiency of someone following a thread she could feel but not yet see the end of. After 20 minutes, she stopped. She had a document in her hand, a letter on yellowed paper written in close handwriting. She held it next to the journal and looked at them both. The handwriting matches, she said quietly. Look. She pointed to specific letter formations, specific characteristics that recurred in both documents. This letter is dated 1846, Lena said. It's from our archives. It was addressed to a trading concern in Boston and discusses plans to establish a settlement at a Vermont river crossing. The author describes building a trading post as the first permanent structure which would serve as both shelter and commercial hub. She showed them the signature, Elias Grover. She pulled out a surveyor's report from 1848 and laid it flat on the table and put the old map from Vera's box beside it. She looked from one to the other for a long moment. The location described in the 1848 survey matches the location on Grover's map. She looked up at them, which, if my understanding of the current property boundaries is correct, matches the location of the structure you purchased. She said it plainly as a professional, stating a conclusion, but her hands were not entirely still. You own Elias Grover's original trading post, she said, the first permanent structure built in Mill Haven. It predates every other building in this town by at least 20 years. Vera looked at Clem. He looked back at her, and she saw in his face what he was thinking, because after 45 years, she could read him as easily as she could read her own thoughts. We spent our last $3, he said, and this is what we got. Lena moved with a speed and purpose that Vera recognized as the particular velocity of someone for whom this was not just interesting, but professionally and personally significant at a level that made efficiency feel urgent. She made calls. The first was to a colleague at the Vermont Historical Society, a woman named Dr. Beatrice Strand, whom she had known from graduate school, and who she described as the state's foremost expert on pre-incorporation settlement history. Dr. Strand said she would drive up the following morning. The second call was to Professor Roland Dexter at UVIM, a specialist in historic property law, who had Lena said handled several significant cases involving colonial-era land grants and their modern legal implications. Professor Dexter asked several specific questions about the documents, questions that Vera could not fully parse, but that made Lena's expression shift in a way that looked significant. He'll come tomorrow, Lena said after the call. He said if the documents are what they sound like, this is not a small matter. Vera asked, what does he think the documents are? Lena chose her words carefully. He thinks the legal documents may include a land grant with attached rights, specifically mineral and water rights, which in Vermont's early settlement period were sometimes granted in perpetuity to the original structure holder as an incentive for establishing trading infrastructure in remote areas. Clem said rights to what land? Lena spread Grover's original map on the table and laid a modern street map of Mill Haven beside it. The grant was for 640 acres along the White River, she said. She put her finger on the modern map. A significant portion of the area that is now Mill Haven sits within those original 640 acres. They sat with that for a moment. Vera thought about the structure in the back corner of the Jenkins property, covered in vines, forgotten by everyone, sold for $3 to two old people in a car, because no one saw anything worth keeping. She thought about the people who had laughed. Not yet, she told herself. Don't think about that yet. Focus on what this is first. Understand it first. Who knows about the rights, Vera asked? Whether they were properly transferred when the land was subdivided over the years. That, Lena said, is exactly what Professor Dexter will need to determine. The experts arrived the following morning. Dr. Beatrice Strand was in her early 60s, a serious woman with the deliberate movements of someone who had learned through experience that haste and historical materials were incompatible. She spent 4 hours with the documents, the journal, the maps, and the structure itself, conducting her examination with the methodical precision of someone who understood that her conclusions would be challenged and wanted them to be unassailable. Her conclusion was not equivocal. This is authenticated, she said, standing outside the tiny structure in the cold afternoon light. The documents are genuine period materials. The journal is Elias Grover's own hand. I've cross-referenced it against 2 other examples of his writing in state archives. This building is the Elias Grover Trading Post, the first permanent structure in Mill Haven. I would stake my professional reputation on it. Professor Roland Dexter arrived an hour after Dr. Strand. He was younger, mid-50s, with the focused and slightly distant manner of someone who processed information in legal frameworks rather than narrative ones. He read the land grant document 3 times and then read the attached charter twice, and then sat at the table in Lena's archive room with his notes and said nothing for 40 minutes while he worked through what he had found. When he looked up, he addressed them with the careful precision of a man who understood that what he said next would change things. I need to be clear that I am not your attorney, he said. You should consult legal representation before acting on any of this. What I can tell you is my professional assessment of what these documents represent. He spread the modern map beside Grover's original grant map. The land grant transferred 640 acres to Elias Grover, with mineral and water rights explicitly attached. Those rights, per the language of the grant, were tied to the original structure in perpetuity. Perpetuity is specific legal language. It means the rights follow the structure, not the land around it, not whoever owns adjacent property, but whoever owns this structure. He looked at them. Over the subsequent 176 years, the land was subdivided multiple times. I've done a preliminary review of the chain of title and found what I expected to find. The mineral and water rights were never explicitly addressed in any of the subdivision transactions. They were simply omitted either through ignorance or through deliberate obscuring, which means they were never legally transferred. He paused, which means they remain attached to the original structure as specified in the grant, which means they belong to whoever owns the original structure, which is you. The room was quiet for a moment. What are the rights worth? Clem asked. The mineral rights in Vermont are probably not substantial, Dexter said. Vermont doesn't have the mineral deposits that make such rights enormously valuable in other states. But the water rights are different. Several commercial properties in Mill Haven are currently using river access that falls within the original grant area without authorization. Those could represent significant negotiated settlements. He laid out his estimate with the even delivery of someone presenting a balance sheet, $2 to $3 million, possibly more, depending on how various parties choose to approach the situation. Vera sat very still. She had expected something. She had felt since the first moment she looked at that vine-covered structure and felt the pull that she still could not fully explain, that there was more here than anyone else could see. She had not expected this. $2 to $3 million. Their last $3 had become $2 to $3 million. The mathematics of it were almost impossible to hold. Lena was watching her carefully. So was Dexter. There's something else, Dexter said. He waited until Vera looked at him. The structure's historical significance qualifies it for immediate consideration for National Register listing. Dr. Strand has already submitted a preliminary nomination. That process, if successful, comes with the protections and also with access to preservation grant funding. There is money available specifically for structures of this significance. He folded his hands on the table. What you purchase for $3 may be an aggregate worth several $1,000,000 in rights and historic value. You should retain an attorney as quickly as possible. Why quickly? Clem asked. Dexter's expression answered before his words did. Because once this becomes known, other parties will have strong financial incentives to challenge it. Conrad Fitch found out on a Thursday. Vera did not know how. Information in small towns moves through channels that are invisible until you trace them backward, and she had not been thinking about information security. She had been thinking about the documents, about the grant, about the journal entries she was reading by lantern light in the evenings. Elias Grover's voice from 1847, describing a settlement coming into being around his trading post, his quiet certainty that what he was building would last. Fitch's attorney called Lena Hartwell's number, which was the only contact information publicly available on a Thursday afternoon. Lena called Vera immediately. Conrad Fitch is filing a motion to challenge the validity of the sale, she said. He's arguing that the estate sale manager lacked authority to transfer a structure of historical significance. He's also arguing that the sale price was so inadequate as to constitute a fraudulent transaction. Vera sat on the wooden floor of the tiny structure and looked at the wall with the carved initials. E.g. 1847. What does that mean for us? She said. It means Lena said carefully that if the court agrees with his argument, the sale could be voided. You would lose the property. Vera was quiet. He has a house on Maple Ridge, Lena continued. It's one of the properties in the original grant area. If the mineral and water rights are confirmed as yours, he's looking at a significant payment or a cloud on his title. He has every reason to want this stopped before it goes further. I understand, Vera said. Lena had found an attorney willing to take the case on a contingency arrangement. Her name was Philippa Olds. She was based in Burlington. She had 20 years of experience in historic property law, and she had agreed after a 40-minute call with Lena to review the case without upfront cost in exchange for a percentage of any settlement. She thinks you have a strong case, Lena said, but she also said to be realistic. Fitch has resources. His attorney is expensive. This could take time. How much time? 6 to 18 months for a full resolution, Lena said. And, Vera, there's something else. She paused. Fitch is also making an informal offer. Through his attorney, he's offering $300,000 for the structure and all associated rights. Clean transaction, immediate. You walk away with $300,000 and he drops the legal challenge. The number sat in the air of the tiny structure. $300,000. Vera looked around the space at the floor where the iron box had waited for 176 years at the wall with the initials carved deep by a man who had wanted someone to know that something important had begun here, at the small window through which the last light of the November afternoon was entering at a low angle and catching the dust in the air and making it briefly improbably beautiful. I need to think, she said. Lena said, of course, but Vera. His attorney gave a 48-hour window on the offer. Vera said, I heard you. That evening, Philippa Olds drove up from Burlington. She was a direct woman with close-cut gray hair and the manner of someone who communicated in exactly the words necessary and no more. She sat on an upturned crate in the tiny structure with Vera and Clem and Lena and spread her materials on the iron box, which had been emptied and was serving as a makeshift table. She went through the case systematically. The estate sale transaction was valid under Vermont law, she said. The administrator of the Jenkins estate had full authority to dispose of structures and any land attached to them. The sale price, while nominal, was accepted by both parties in good faith. Fitch's fraudulent transaction argument will not hold. That's good, Clem said. However, Philippa continued, Fitch has substantial resources and his attorney is experienced in exactly this kind of delay tactic. Even a weak legal argument costs money to defeat, and there is a secondary approach he may take. She looked at them. Vermont has a mechanism for civic acquisition of historically significant properties in private hands. It requires a town council vote and the payment of fair market value. If Fitch can convince the town council that the Grover Trading Post should belong to the town rather than to private individuals, they could potentially initiate a condemnation proceeding. In that case, Philippa said the valuation becomes contested. The town would likely argue that the fair market value of the structure is its historical value, not its legal rights value. You could end up receiving significantly less than the full worth of what you own. She looked at the offer letter from Fitch's attorney. $300,000 is not a generous offer, she said. It's a fraction of what the full rights are potentially worth, but it is a certain amount available immediately compared to an uncertain amount available at the end of a potentially lengthy and expensive legal process. She looked at them both directly. I can fight this. I believe we will win. but I want you to understand what winning might look like and how long it might take." After she left, Vera and Clem sat alone in the structure. The November cold had settled into the wood around them. The lantern cast its warm, limited circle. Outside, the wind moved through the oaks at the edge of the property, and the sound of it against the old walls was the sound the structure had been hearing for over 170 years. Fitch's offer was on the floor between them, a single sheet of paper with a number on it, $300,000. More money than they had seen in any single document in their lives. More than the house on Maple Street had sold for. More than they had accumulated in 4 decades of work and saving before the medical bills had come and taken it in less than 2 years. Clem said it would be enough. We could be warm. We could be safe. We could live somewhere real. He was not arguing for taking it. He was naming what it was. Vera picked up the document. She held it. The paper was heavy stock professional, the kind of paper that belonged to a world where $3 was a negligible rounding error. The kind of paper that had been used with various letterheads in various sums to explain to her and Clem that the things they thought were theirs were not quite theirs in the specific ways that mattered. She looked at the document for a long time. Then she reached into her bag and took out Elias Grover's journal. She had been reading it in the evenings, a few pages at a time, moving through the year 1847 from spring through fall, through the establishment of the settlement, the first families, the slow growth of something from nothing in a Vermont river valley that most people in Boston had probably never heard of. She had been learning Grover's voice, his cadence, his particular way of observing what was happening around him with a mixture of practicality and quiet wonder. She turned to the entry she had found 2 nights before, the one she had come back to several times since. May 14th, 1850. She read it aloud. "I have been mocked by merchants in Burlington who said this post would fail. They called it a fool's venture, a matchbox in the wilderness not worth the timber used to build it. They laughed. I have been accustomed to being laughed at by people whose vision reaches no further than their immediate comfort. Let them mock. This land will outlast their laughter. What is built on true ground will stand. What is built to serve a genuine need will continue to be needed. I have secured these documents beneath the floor of my post, that they might be preserved for those who come after. Whoever finds them, know this, it was worth it. Every day of it." She set the journal down. She looked at the offer letter in her hand. Clem watched her. She placed the letter carefully on the floor between them. "We're not selling," she said. The lantern burned between them. Outside, the wind moved through the November oaks, the same sound it had been making in this place since before either of them was born, since before anyone now living in Millhaven was born, since a man named Elias Grover had stood in this space and decided that something was worth beginning. Here, that the laughter of merchants was not a reason to stop, that what was built on true ground would stand. "We're going to fight," Vera said, "and we're going to win, and then we're going to decide what to do with what we find." She picked up Grover's journal and held it in both hands. "He built this for someone who would come after him," she said. "He didn't know who, he didn't know when. He just knew that whatever he was starting here mattered enough to preserve." She looked at the wall with the carved initials, e.g. 1847. "I think he knew what he was doing," Vera said quietly. "I think he knew exactly what he was doing." Part 3. The Value of Something. Philippa Olds filed the response on a Monday morning, 7 days after Conrad Fitch's attorney had delivered the 48-hour offer that Vera had declined. The response was, in Philippa's words, comprehensive. It addressed every element of Fitch's challenge to the sale's validity, cited the relevant Vermont statutes regarding estate administration authority, documented the good faith nature of the transaction, and included an affidavit from the Jenkins estate administrator confirming that the sale had been conducted within the full scope of his legal authority. It also included attached as exhibits copies of the authenticated documents from the Iron Box, the preliminary verification from Dr. Beatrice Strand, and a letter from Professor Roland Dexter outlining his assessment of the property rights. Philippa had also filed simultaneously an application for emergency historic site designation with the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. This was a procedural move as much as a preservation one. Once the designation process was formally initiated, any attempt to demolish, alter, or forcibly transfer the structure became legally complicated in ways that benefited the current owner. Vera read through the filings at the library table where Lena had set up a small workspace for them, their documents organized in labeled folders, their case taking on the physical shape that legal proceedings require. She read carefully the way she had always read, not for speed but for comprehension, making sure she understood not just what each document said, but what it meant. Clem sat beside her, reading the same pages when she passed them, asking questions that were always practical and sometimes exactly the right ones. The response to Fitch's motion to void the sale came from the local court 11 days later. Motion denied. 2 words. Philippa called to deliver them with the crisp satisfaction of a professional who had anticipated this outcome, but understood that anticipated outcomes still required verification. The transaction is confirmed as valid, Philippa said. The estate administrator had full authority. The price was accepted by both parties without duress. There is no legal basis for voiding the sale. Vera sat with the phone against her ear and looked out the window of the tiny structure at the November property around her. The oaks had lost most of their remaining leaves in a windstorm the previous week and stood bare now against a sky that had finally, after days of threat, delivered the first thin snow of the season. It lay in a light cover over the ground, over the cleared area around the structure, over the stone at the edge of the property where Vera had taken to sitting in the mornings. That's the beginning, Vera said. Not the end, correct, Philippa said. He'll appeal or he'll find another avenue. I expect the next move within 2 weeks. She was off by 3 days. Conrad Fitch had lived in Millhaven for 11 years. He had arrived from Boston with capital from a series of successful real estate developments in Massachusetts, and Connecticut had purchased 2 commercial properties on Main Street and the large Victorian house on Maple Ridge, and had inserted himself into the town's civic life with the systematic efficiency of a man who understood that influence in small towns is built through visibility and selective generosity. He was on the library board. He had donated the benches in the town square. His name appeared on the plaque outside the renovated fire station as a contributing sponsor. He was not a man accustomed to being on the losing side of a property dispute, and he was not, Vera had concluded, after watching him operate for several weeks, a man who changed strategies when the first one failed. He simply found a different angle from which to apply pressure. The town council meeting was announced 3 weeks after Philippa's successful defense of the initial challenge. The agenda item read, discussion of historic site acquisition, Grover Trading Post property. Lena called Vera as soon as the agenda was posted. He's going for civic acquisition, she said. It's what Philippa warned about. He's going to argue that a site of this historical significance to Millhaven should belong to the town rather than to private individuals. If the council votes to pursue it, they can initiate a condemnation proceeding. What does that mean for us, practically? If it goes through, Lena said, the valuation is set by the town's assessors. They will almost certainly value it at its historic preservation value rather than its full legal rights value. You'd receive far less than what Philippa estimates the rights are worth. How much less the historic value of the structure and a small parcel of land, Lena said. Maybe $60,000 to $80,000. The mineral and water rights would transfer to the town along with the property, and you'd receive nothing for them. So we'd lose $2 million and receive $80,000. That's the scenario, Lena said. Yes. There was a pause. Vera, Lena said, I've been talking to people in town. Not everyone is with Fitch on this. Some people are uncomfortable with what's happening. The story of how you found the building, what was inside it, what you've been through. People know. Small towns know everything. Some of them are rethinking how they've been watching this unfold. Vera stood at the window of the structure and looked at the snow on the ground outside. When is the meeting? 2 weeks from Thursday. The 2 weeks between the announcement and the meeting had a specific texture that Vera would remember afterward as one of the more clarifying periods of her life. She and Clem continued to live in the structure. They had by this point made it genuinely habitable in the modest sense that word allowed within 100 square feet. The sleeping bags had been supplemented by a small propane heater that Lena had quietly appeared with one morning, along with a folding table and 2 camp chairs. A local pastor, whose name Vera had not yet learned, had left a box of groceries at the edge of the property without a note. The Millhaven Grange had reached out through Lena to offer a weekly supply of staples. The mockery on social media had shifted. Neil Braddock's posts, which had accumulated followers through the first 2 weeks, had taken on a different quality as the story developed. The initial contempt had given way in the comment sections, at least to a complicated reassessment. People who had shared the original post with laughter were now returning to the threads to say things that varied in their articulateness, but shared a common direction. The world had found out what $3 had purchased, and the world's response to that information was not uniform, but it was not laughter. Vera spent the 2 weeks doing several things simultaneously. She read Elias Grover's journal from beginning to end. She took notes on what she found there, cross-referencing with the historical records Lena had helped her access, building a picture of the man who had built this structure and the settlement that had grown around it. She wanted to understand what he had intended, not just what he had built. She worked on what she was going to say at the town meeting, and she thought carefully and at length and without rushing herself about what she wanted to do with what they had found. Clem sat with her through many of these evenings, saying little, listening to her, think aloud, occasionally asking the precise question that helped her find the edge of something she had been circling. He had always been good at that. It was one of the things she had loved about him since before she knew she loved him. On the fifth evening, he said, "You already know what you want to do. You've known for a while." She looked at him. "I want to know why you know that before I tell you," she said. "Because you stopped arguing with yourself 3 days ago," he said. "When you're still deciding, you argue. When you've decided, you go quiet and start working out the details." She smiled. He was right. The town hall meeting room held approximately 120 people when full. It was full. Vera and Clem arrived early at Philippa's suggestion and sat in the front row at Mayor Dolores Cranston's specific invitation, an invitation that had been extended through Lena and that had surprised Vera slightly when she received it. Mayor Cranston was a practical woman in her late 50s who had held office for 3 terms and who had, in those 3 terms, developed the specific political instinct of someone who knows the difference between a situation that is manageable and one that has become something else entirely. The Grover Trading Post situation had become something else entirely. Lena sat beside Vera. Philippa Olds sat at the end of the row with her materials. Behind them, the room filled steadily, people taking seats with the specific, purposeful energy of citizens who have decided that something is happening that requires their presence. Vera looked around the room without turning in her chair. She could do enough of this with peripheral vision. Conrad Fitch sat on the right side, 3 rows back, with his attorney beside him. He was dressed carefully, as he always was, with the presentation of a man who understood that appearance in small-town civic settings and communicated authority just as it did in boardrooms. His expression was composed. Roy Alderman was there, which surprised her. He was sitting toward the back alone, and when Vera's gaze crossed his, he looked at his hands. Neil and Suzanne Braddock were there. Neil was not holding his phone, which she noted. Dr. Beatrice Strand had driven up from Burlington for the meeting, which was not in the nature of her work, but which she had chosen to do anyway, and sat near the back with the quiet attention of an expert observer. Mayor Cranston called the meeting to order. She ran through the standard business quickly and efficiently, and then introduced the matter of the Trading Post acquisition proposal. Councilman Gerald Whitby, who had seconded Fitch's acquisition motion, presented the case in formal terms. The argument was, as Philippa had predicted the argument, that a structure of unique historical significance to Millhaven should be in public hands rather than private ones. The town had an obligation to its history. The Grover Trading Post was the foundation of everything Millhaven was. It should belong to all of Millhaven's citizens, not to individuals who had acquired it through a transaction that, while technically valid, had involved incomplete information on both sides. He said technically valid with the careful intonation of a man inserting a qualifier without explicitly arguing the point his principal had already failed to argue in court. Philippa leaned slightly toward Vera and said very quietly, "He's going to propose a valuation hearing." He did. Several council members spoke. Several citizens spoke from the floor. The arguments moved in predictable directions. Civic ownership against private rights. Historical significance against individual property claims, the town's interest against a particular couple's circumstance. Through all of it, Vera sat with her hands in her lap and listened. She had promised Philippa she would not react, and she did not react. She listened. Conrad Fitch did not speak. He did not need to. Other people were making his argument for him with the fluency of people who had been talking to him over the past several weeks. Mayor Cranston, when the floor discussion had run its course, looked at the front row. "I believe Mrs. Hutchins has requested the opportunity to address the council," she said. "We will hear from her now." Vera stood. She had worn her good clothes. Not because the clothes would change anything about the argument, but because this mattered, and things that mattered deserved the respect of presentation. Her gray hair was brushed and pinned. She stood straight in the way she had been standing straight for the past several months, since the county assistant's office, since the estate sale, since the first morning she had woken up in this strange small structure and understood that the only direction available was forward. She did not use notes. 3 months ago, she said, my husband Clem and I purchased a structure for $3. All the money we had in the world. She did not rush. We had lost everything to medical bills. Clem had pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. He survived, which the doctors described as unlikely, and we are grateful for that every day. The cost of that survival was our savings, our home, our stability. We had been living in our car for 3 weeks. We were sleeping in a Honda Accord in November in Vermont. Some of you knew that. Several people in the room were very still. We came to the Jenkins estate sale with $3 because we had nowhere else to go and nothing to lose. I saw a vine-covered structure in the back corner of the property, and I felt something could not explain. Something I have learned over 68 years to trust rather than dismiss. I persuaded my husband to spend our last $3 on something that everyone present described as garbage. She looked around the room without hurrying. Many of you photographed us. Some of you posted those photographs to mock us publicly. You called our home a matchbox. You called us crazy, pathetic, desperate. You stopped your cars on the road to take pictures of us working. You live-streamed us as entertainment. The room was very quiet. I am not telling you this to make you feel bad. I am telling you because it is true, and because truth is what this room needs right now. She let the quiet hold for a moment. What we found in that structure, she continued, is not a discovery that belongs to us by luck. We found it because we were looking. We found it because we were there every day working with what we had, paying attention with everything we could bring to bear the way people pay attention when they have nothing else to rely on. Elias Grover built that trading post in 1847, and he sealed his documents under the floor because he believed that someone would come someday and find them. He wrote in his journal that he had been mocked by people whose vision reached no further than their immediate comfort. She paused. He understood something about what it means to see value where others see nothing. I think he built this town on that understanding. She reached into her bag and placed a single document on the table facing the council. My husband and I have made several decisions about what we intend to do with what we found, and I would like to share them with you tonight. She looked at the council directly. First, regarding the mineral rights. We are aware that a number of property owners in Millhaven hold land within the original Grover grant, and that questions about the status of those mineral rights create uncertainty for them. We are not interested in that uncertainty. We are proposing to make those rights available to each affected property owner for a flat fee of $100 per parcel, regardless of size, paid to the Grover Foundation, which I will describe in a moment. This resolves the title question fairly and permanently for every affected homeowner. She heard the shift in the room, not a sound exactly, more a change in the quality of attention. Second, regarding the water rights. We are donating them to the town of Millhaven in perpetuity with a single condition that they be used for public benefit and that no private commercial entity may monopolize access to them. Water should belong to everyone. Mayor Cranston had stopped writing. Third, regarding the Grover trading post itself. We are not selling it to the town. We are not selling it to anyone. She looked briefly at Conrad Fitch. Instead, we are establishing the Grover Foundation, a nonprofit organization with a specific purpose. The trading post and the surrounding land will be preserved and restored using the preservation grant funds that Dr. Strand's nomination will make available. Once restored, the site will serve as a community resource center focused on helping elderly residents of Millhaven who are facing the kind of crisis that Clem and I faced. Emergency assistance with utilities, food support, medication help, temporary housing resources, the things that keep a person from sleeping in their car in November. She looked at her husband. We will live on the property as caretakers, and we will run the foundation ourselves with whatever help this community chooses to offer. Any funds from the mineral rights settlements and from donations will go directly into supporting people who need it. We are not taking salaries. We are not taking profits. We are taking a home and a purpose, which is what we had before everything went wrong, and which is we have concluded everything that matters. She picked up her document. Clem and I know what it is to have nothing. We know what it is to be mocked and dismissed because you are old and poor, and your circumstances look foolish to people who have not experienced them. We do not want anyone else in this town to go through what we went through alone. Elias Grover built something here because he believed a settlement needed a center, a place where travelers could find what they needed to continue. We want to do the same thing. She looked at the council. We asked the council to withdraw the acquisition motion and to support the Grover Foundation's work in this community. We think that is a better use of what we found than any alternative on the table tonight. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms are quiet after something has changed the shape of the air inside them. Then it was not quiet. Mayor Cranston called for order twice before the room settled back into something procedural. She looked at Conrad Fitch. Fitch was looking at the table in front of him. His attorney leaned over and said something quietly. Fitch said something in return, and the attorney nodded and made a note. Gerald Whitby, who had presented the acquisition motion, cleared his throat. In light of Mrs. Hutchins' proposal, he said, I would like to request that we table the acquisition discussion for 30 days to allow the council to review the foundation proposal in detail. The motion to table passed unanimously. Mayor Cranston looked at Vera. I would like to address this room directly, the mayor said. She did not look at her notes. She looked at the citizens of Millhaven. When this situation began, many of us responded to the Hutchins family with cruelty. I am including myself in that assessment. I did not personally post photographs or live stream their work, but I was aware of it happening, and I did not speak against it. That is its own form of failure. These two people came to our town in the worst circumstances of their lives, having given everything they had to save Clem Hutchins' life, and our community's response was to make them objects of entertainment. She paused. They have responded to that treatment with more generosity than we had any right to expect. They have offered us water rights worth hundreds of thousands of dollars as a gift. They have proposed a resolution to the mineral rights question that protects every affected homeowner at a nominal cost. And they have committed to using what they found to help the most vulnerable members of our community. She looked around the room. I want to say formally and on behalf of this council that I am sorry. I am sorry for how this town treated you. I am sorry that we laughed when we should have helped. And I am grateful that your response to that failure has been to offer us something better than we deserved. The room was again very still. Then someone in the back began to applaud. It spread quickly the way things spread in rooms where people have been sitting with something they needed to express. And within seconds, the entire room was applauding, the sound filling the town hall meeting room with a quality that Vera had not heard in a very long time. She sat straight and did not cry because she had decided before the meeting that she would not cry in this room, that this was not the place for that. Clem took her hand under the table and held it. Conrad Fitch approached them afterward when the formal meeting had ended, and people were milling in the way of people who have witnessed something and need to process it through conversation. He came without his attorney. He was alone, which was, Vera thought, probably a considered choice. He was a large man, Fitch broad through the shoulders with the physical confidence of someone who had been the largest person in most rooms for most of his life. He stood before Vera and Clem and looked at them, and the confidence was still there, but something had been adjusted in it. Mrs. Hutchins, he said. Mr. Hutchins? Mr. Fitch. He was quiet for a moment, assembling something. What you're proposing to do, he said. With the mineral rights, with the water rights, he stopped. The legal challenge. I want you to know that I will be withdrawing it, formally, tomorrow morning. Vera waited. And I want to make a contribution, Fitch said, to the foundation, a significant one. He said the number quietly for them only, and it was significant. I'd like it to be used for operating costs so that the mineral rights settlements can go entirely to direct assistance. Vera looked at him for a moment. She thought about the motion filed to void her $3 purchase. She thought about the offer letter on the floor of the tiny structure, the pressure of it, the 48-hour window. She thought about the condemnation proposal designed to strip most of the value from what they had found. She thought about Elias Grover writing that he had been mocked by men whose vision reached no further than their immediate comfort. Thank you, she said. We accept, and we'll use it exactly as you have described. He nodded. He started to turn away. Mr. Fitch, Vera said. He stopped. We're going to need people who understand property and development to advise us on the restoration. If you're interested in contributing in that way as well, we would welcome it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation he thought he had fully mapped. I'll be in touch, he said. Neil Braddock found them near the door as they were preparing to leave. Suzanne was with him, and they both had the look of people who have been carrying something uncomfortable for some time and have decided to set it down regardless of the awkwardness of the setting. Neil did not have his phone out. This was, Vera noted, the first time she had seen him in a public context without it. Mrs. Hutchins, he said. Mr. Hutchins, I want to apologize. His voice was even, which told her he had prepared what he was going to say and was delivering it as prepared rather than improvising. What we did, the photos, the live streams, the posts, it was wrong, it was cruel. We treated your situation as entertainment, and that was not acceptable. He looked at Vera directly. What you just did in there, he said. What you're planning to do with what you found. I don't have the right words for it. We accept your apology, Vera said. Suzanne said, we'd like to donate as well. Whatever you can use. Vera looked at them both. She thought about day 2 of the Hutchins Matchbox experiment. She thought about the small crowd that had gathered on the road to watch her and Clem work, about the particular quality of public humiliation, about the way Clem's shoulders had tensed. She thought about a 70-year-old man who had spent 30 years fixing broken lockers and clearing snow from parking lots so that other people's children could get to school safely, standing in a vine-covered property in November, trying to make something out of nothing while people with phones recorded his shame. She thought about what it cost Clem to stand straight through that and not say what he felt. And she thought about what it cost to be those people, the people with the phones, the people so insulated from genuine difficulty that someone else's difficulty read as content. The cost was not visible from outside, but it was real. We accept that too, she said. She paused. There's one more thing. When the foundation launches in the spring, we'd like you to share it. The same platforms, the same reach you use for the other posts. We need people to know it exists, Neil nodded. He looked like he meant it. We'll be there, he said. The weeks that followed were the beginning of construction in the most fundamental sense. Not of the building, though that came too. The building's restoration, funded by the preservation grant that Dr. Strand's nomination had accelerated, was scheduled to begin in late winter with completion by early summer. The team selected was from a firm in Burlington that specialized in historic structures and whose principal had visited the site and stood inside the trading post for 20 minutes without speaking, running her hands over the joinery at the corners before saying that this was the most significant project she had been offered in 15 years. The construction that happened first was of the Grover Foundation itself. Philippa Olds guided them through the nonprofit formation process with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what was required and did not see the point in taking longer than necessary. Lena Hartwell agreed after 3 conversations and 1 long evening at the library table to serve as the foundation's director. She resigned from her adjunct position with what she described as no regret whatsoever. They hired a social worker. They hired an administrative assistant. Both were Millhaven residents who had connections to the specific needs the foundation was designed to address, who understood the particular pride that made certain elderly residents reluctant to ask for help, and the specific conversations that helped them move past that reluctance. The mineral rights settlements came through over the following 6 weeks. 104 property owners within the original Grover Grant area paid their $100 and received clear title documentation that resolved the uncertainty that had been hanging over their deeds. The process was simpler than anyone had expected because Philippa had designed it to be simple, because complexity was not what Vera and Clem were after. The water rights were formally donated to Millhaven on a Tuesday morning in early January. Mayor Cranston presided over a brief ceremony at Town Hall. Vera and Clem attended, accepted the mayor's thanks, and went home. The iron box sat on the folding table in the restored trading post through the winter after the preservation team had done their initial assessment and confirmed that it did not need to be moved to controlled storage. It was the only item from the original contents that remained in the building, rather than going to the Vermont Historical Society's archive. Everything else, the journal, the maps, the correspondence, the grant documents, and the charter had been transferred to Dr. Strand's care for professional preservation and display. The iron box had come back because it belonged here. Vera had placed it on the table so that it was the first thing you saw when you came through the door. She could not have said precisely why. Something about it seemed right. Something about the presence of the container, the thing that had held everything for 176 years in the dark beneath the floor, waiting without impatience for whoever would come and find it. On the first day of February, Clem found the frame at the hardware store on Main Street, a simple wood frame, 4 inches by 6 with a plain glass front. He paid for it with money from the foundation's operating account, which he noted in the ledger as petty cash miscellaneous, and brought it home and opened the frame and placed inside it the single dollar bill he had kept from the $3 of the original purchase. He had been carrying it in his wallet since the day of the estate sale. He had not known quite why at the time. He knew now. He hung the frame beside the trading post front door on the right side at I Live O. Below it, he attached a small brass plaque, the same kind used for plaques on old buildings with engraved text that read, "The value of something isn't its price. It's what you're willing to see in it." He stepped back and looked at it. Vera came and stood beside him. They had been standing beside each other in various configurations for 45 years, in kitchens and hospital waiting rooms and courtrooms and town hall meetings and a vine-covered corner of a Vermont property in November, with $3 between them and nothing ahead but the choice of what to do with that. The winter light was coming through the restored windows, the new glass that matched the original as closely as the preservation team could achieve, and it fell across the wooden floor that had been cleaned and sealed, but not replaced because the original boards were what they were, and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. The floor where the iron box had waited in the dark for 176 years. The floor where Clem had crouched with a screwdriver and found the loose plank. The floor where everything had changed. The first cohort of people served by the Grover Foundation came through the door in March. There were 7 of them in the first month. A widow whose electric bill had not been paid in 3 months because she was choosing between heat and medication. A veteran in his late 70s who had been 2 weeks from eviction when Lena's social worker reached him through the church network. A couple in their early 70s, both retired, whose fixed income had been disrupted by an unexpected medical expense that had the quality of a small version of what Vera and Clem had experienced on a much larger scale. Others. Vera met each of them. She did not have a speech prepared. She did not have a program to explain or a procedure to walk them through. She just sat with them the way Dorothea had sat with people in the Millhaven Library for 20 years, giving them her actual attention, listening to the specific shape of their situation before saying anything at all. She understood what it felt like to sit across a desk from someone and explain that everything you had accumulated in a lifetime of work was gone and you were not sure what came next. She had done that herself in the county assistant's office with $3.17 in her wallet and a Honda Accord in the parking lot with 230,000 miles on the odometer. That understanding was not something she had learned from a training manual or a social work textbook. It was something she carried in her body the way you carry things that have happened to you close to the center, not as a wound but as a kind of knowledge. By April, the foundation had assisted 23 people. By June, when the trading post restoration was formally completed and Lena organized a small ceremony for the opening, the number was 31. Dr. Strand came for the opening. Professor Dexter came. Philippa Olds came. Mayor Cranston came and made a short speech that was, Vera thought, genuinely good rather than performatively good, the speech of a person who had done some reckoning with herself and come out changed. Conrad Fitch came. He stood near the back and looked at the restored structure with the expression of a man who understood perhaps for the first time the full shape of what he had attempted to take. Roy Alderman came. He shook Clem's hand for a long time without saying much, and Clem let him, which was his own kind of generosity. Neil and Suzanne Braddock came, and Neil did what he had promised, recording the opening with the same professional quality he applied to everything, posting it to the same platforms where the original mockery had lived, and the response was different in every possible way. People shared it with the specific energy of those who want to believe that certain kinds of stories are real. The response to the Grover Foundation's launch post in the first week received more engagement than the original mockery posts ever had. Vera noticed this without being particularly moved by it. The external validation was real, but it was not the point, and she did not want to confuse it for the point. One evening in late June, with the summer light lasting long in the Vermont sky, and the Foundation's first full fiscal quarter drawing to a close with more people helped than they had initially projected, Vera and Clem sat on the porch that had been built as part of the restoration, a simple wood structure attached to the front of the trading post, with chairs that faced the property, and beyond it the hills and the town below. The Millhaven they could see from this elevation had been here since before either of them was born. It had grown from a single trading post built by a man who had been mocked by merchants in Burlington and had proceeded anyway. It had grown around that post and eventually to forgotten it. Let it disappear under vines, and decades sold it at an estate sale for $3 to two old people in a car because no one else saw a reason to keep it. 43 people helped so far, Clem said. He had the ledger in his lap. He kept the ledger himself by hand and pencil, the way he had kept maintenance records at the high school for 30 years. 43, Vera said. He closed the ledger. When we die, he said, what do you want people to remember about this? She thought about it, not quickly because it deserved to be thought about properly. I want them to remember that vision is a skill, she said finally, not a gift. You learn it by refusing to accept other people's assessments of what is possible. You practice it by continuing to look at things that everyone else has decided are worthless. She watched the evening light change on the hills. And I want them to remember Elias Grover, she said. He built this for someone he would never meet. He didn't know who would come or when or what they would find or what they would do with it. He just built it true and sealed what mattered under the floor and trusted that the world contained people who would eventually show up and understand what they were standing in. Clem looked at the frame beside the door, the single-dollar bill in its plain wood frame. $3, he said. $3, she agreed. The evening light was doing what Vermont evening light does in June, extending itself past its reasonable duration, painting the hills in colors that required no enhancement and no explanation. Vera reached over and took Clem's hand and held it. The trading post stood behind them, its stone foundation exactly where Elias Grover had placed it in 1847, its restored walls bearing the evidence of what it had survived, its carved initials deep in the wood, where they had been for 176 years, and where they would remain for however many more followed. What is built on true ground will stand. What is built to serve a genuine need will continue to be needed. The foundation's lights were on inside Lena, finishing the day's work at her desk, the files of 43 people organized in careful order, the beginning of what would become over the years ahead a much larger record of people seen and helped and sent forward into their next chapters was something they had not had before. The town that had laughed spread out below them, lit now against the darkening sky, every light representing a life of history, a set of decisions made, and consequences lived, the whole of it built on ground that had once been nothing but a river crossing and a man's belief that something could begin here. It had. Vera held her husband's hand in the June evening and breathed the clean air off the Vermont hills and felt in a way she had not felt in 2 years of fear and loss, in the grinding machinery of catastrophe, the specific warmth of a life that had found its right shape. Not the shape she had planned, not the shape she would have chosen in advance, but the shape that had been waiting in a vine-covered corner of a property in November, in a structure no one wanted, in a cavity, under a loose floorboard, sealed in an iron box with a rusted lock, patient and certain, waiting for someone willing to spend their last $3 on the possibility that the world contained more than it appeared to. It did. It always had.